Hello, everyone. I am so happy to have Sheri Cotuna on the podcast today. We've been messaging back and forth online for a while, and it's been incredible to hear the bits and pieces of their story and then reading their story in the Grace Report. But thank you so much for coming on the show today, Sheri.
Thank you. It's very nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Very
Awesome.
good.
For those who are not familiar with you, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Sheri Cotuna. I went to Bob Jones I graduated in 93. I was kind of raised through Bob Jones. My dad was there when I was a toddler through early elementary school and then went out as a Bob Jones missionary. So we had Dr. Bob III come down to the island where my parents worked to cover up sexual abuse while I was a child. So I kind of learned their view on abuse from the time I was pretty young. And in high school, my dad was back in the US as a Bob Jones pastor, and then I attended during my university years.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know you also were interviewed for the Grace Report, and I know that's why you're coming on the show today. So, whatever you're comfortable with sharing your story as recorded in the Grace Report, but also anything outside of that that's not in that you're comfortable sharing, whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay. I attended Bob Jones, and Christmas Eve and early Christmas morning of 1993, I was working at a special needs residence for adult men with developmental disabilities. And I had a coworker who I didn't typically work with. He worked a different shift, but we were assigned to work multiple shifts in a row because of the holidays. And I was told I could sleep during the third shift because of the multiple shifts, but which I did. But then I woke up to him sexually assaulting me. And the assault went on through the night into the early hours of the morning. And that next morning, I was supposed to be at a faculty member's house who they were close friends of my family through my growing up years. And I went there, but I was struggling quite a bit. I didn't intend to tell her anything that happened, but I was really sick. I kept throwing up and just really, really struggling. And she started asking questions and realized what happened. And she called the student. She knew who he was because he was in her classes. She called him. He admitted it to her. And then she told him that he needed to turn himself into the school. And then she called Jim Berg and made the report to him. He said that I needed to come in and be interviewed by him, which I did shortly after. And in his interview, his focus was on what could I have done that would make God use this young man to get my attention. He asked all the normal questions about what I was wearing, whether we had ever dated, whether how well I knew him, had I ever flirted with him. Because I was at work, it was obvious I hadn't used alcohol or anything like that. And it was winter. I was very covered, and he basically came to the conclusion that I must have been out of sorts with the Lord. I hadn't been attending a BJU affiliated church faithfully, and so God had caused this to happen so that I would know him and follow him in a more perfect way. I left completely shamed and without hope, feeling like really there was no hope. I was a perfectionist. I had tried to please God perfectly throughout my years at school and hadn't felt successful in that. And he just pretty much laid it out there that I had not succeeded and that this was going to be the life that I would have if I didn't find a way to please God more perfectly. After that, I did decide to go to a church. I picked the Bob Jones church that I thought was the most conservative. It was the church that my Bible teacher was the pastor of, and thinking that that would please God and that I would be protected from future situations like this. When I went, he called me aside and said that he had been informed of what happened and that I was not welcome at his church, that only pure people were permitted to go to their church. And since this had happened to me, I was clearly impure. I asked him, a friend who was with me at the time, and I knew that she had been sexually abused in an orphanage when she was a child. So I asked him to clarify that he wasn't referring to young children, and he clarified that yes, that it wasn't possible for a child to be sexually abused unless they were impure. It wasn't possible. So again, I left pretty hopeless and feeling that I was hated by God and that nothing I could do would ever please him. So yeah, that's pretty much what happened.
I am so sorry for all that you've gone through.
Thank you.
Oh God. It's so heartbreaking to hear someone go through this a horrible, completely life-changing thing and show no love or compassion at all. And just, it's horrible because they portray God as just really this abusive partner that if you don't do exactly what God wants, God's going to abuse you. Is that something that you took away from that? Is that what you?
Yes, I had been raised to believe that Bob Jones's view of God was the correct view. And I saw them still as an authority in my life and kind of the voice of God. So their words of condemnation relegated me to truly having no hope that
Mhm.
I could ever please God. I didn't understand that he chose, the one who assaulted me chose to do this. In every way, it was portrayed as this godly young man had to be used as God's tool to get your attention. So it was just my fault. It was all
Oh,
on me.
mm,
About a year later, Mr. Tony Miller, who was the dean of men, called me at my work and said that they were planning to bring the student back to school and they wanted him to finish his education. And they wanted to make sure that I wasn't planning to file any kind of legal charges because that would destroy this godly young man's life and prohibit him from serving God. And that would affect future people being able to go to heaven because he was going to serve God as a missionary. So I told him that I was very fearful of the offender, that after he had assaulted me, he found out where I lived and kept coming to my house, leaving notes on my car overnight, telling me that he was thinking of me and wondered how much I remembered of the events and wanted to know what I was thinking of late at night. And he laughed, Mr. Miller, and said that why would this godly young man want anything to do with me after what I did to him? And what I did to him was simply letting the school know what had happened. So, yeah.
my God. Just the re-traumatization, all these things. Like you were the one in need of help. And they did everything exactly the opposite, as far to the extreme of what a survivor needs. And I'm so, so sorry. It just, wow. I just, yeah, I'm just trying to find, gosh, how are you doing right now? I want
I'm
to make sure
okay.
you're good. Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay. It's hard to think back to those
Yeah.
times. I try not to think about it.
Oh my gosh. And because this, when you were saying that, it made me think of that infamous case with that rapist. I think his name was like Barack or something, but just some basic white guy. And they didn't want his reputation to be ruined. And he brutally raped this girl. And I'm just still trying to understand just the thinking around this of the lack of care for the woman in these situations, a lack of care for you, and so worried. Like, I don't understand how they could even say that he's a godly young man after that. I don't understand how they could. I don't, maybe it's good that I don't understand that. But oh my God, I just,
I got the impression from what they said, that Berg said especially, that God was trying to get my attention, and this was just somebody kind of there at the moment for God to use. So it was kind of just unfortunate for him that he was the one that was there.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because fundamentalism is so contradictory because they harp and harp and harp about free will all the time. But apparently, this man did not have free will or any choice, which just, yeah, the system is just rigged in the favor of those that are powerful. And that's one of the many reasons that system is so abusive. And oh my gosh. So, was there anything not in the Grace Report that you would like to share?
The only thing that I can think of specifically was that, when Dr. Bob, before the Grace report happened, it was kind of triggered by Dr. Bob's statements saying that they had never, ever, ever covered up sexual abuse. And when I was 9 or 10, he came to the island where I was living specifically to cover up the sexual abuse of one of their missionaries. They had 5 missionaries there on the island at the time that were BJU missionaries. One of them was an offender and had been offending for reportedly at least 5 years that the other missionaries were aware of. And he came down specifically to cover that up. And at the end of that whole situation, that missionary was the only one still employed by Bob Jones. All of the other missionaries were fired they all agreed, as far as I was told, they had all agreed not to say anything because it would harm God's reputation and Bob Jones's reputation, but they wouldn't sign something saying that it didn't happen and that they would support the missionary. So they were all let go, and he was continually employed by the school as a missionary. So that's decades before I was assaulted. That is how they handle sexual abuse. I grew up knowing that. I knew their teachings before that, from my years at the school and also from my years growing up affiliated with them. But that's probably the one thing that I would say they didn't include that I was a child when it happened and the missionaries involved weren't going to testify about it. And what I knew as a child, having grown
Oh,
up with these things happening.
oh my gosh. Just from that young age, realizing that you won't be protected, that you're not safe in this environment, that the confusion all around that too. Oh my gosh. I can't imagine.
We were told we were living sacrifices, that we had to be willing for God to do anything to us and submit to it and be willing for it to happen in order for other people to become Christians.
Oh my God. Wow, that's horrible. It's just awful. So something else I wanted to ask if you're comfortable sharing the name of the abuser and if there's been anything else that has been made public about them.
Yes, his name is Richard Duvall, and he is a missionary to Bolivia. He When I reported him to the police, he was in the US, but the police contacted his pastor in Illinois, Paul Kingsbury, to try to contact him. And what I was told was that Paul Kingsbury immediately whisked him off to Bolivia so that the police could not question him. And he's remained there since. He has an attorney from a well known evangelical church in the area who has advised him to not return to the US, to not risk being charged. That was after, his mission board initially supported him, but after some years and some publicity, he's been in the news multiple times. They dismissed him and encouraged him to turn himself in to the police. And Richard and Paul Kingsbury are connected with kind of a network of offenders so they've been in the news multiple times. I think you're already aware of some of that.
I'm just thinking to the Preacher's Voice podcast because I know he's talked a lot about North Love, and we had someone on here talk about North Love Baptist Church. Like Paul Kingsbury is a name that comes up a lot in the
Right,
independent fundamental Baptist movement abuse
right.
stuff. Oh my
So
gosh.
Nate Plouts, I think that's the last name. He read the Grace report and realized that, wait a minute, this offender that's being identified was my high school Bible teacher and is the person that Paul Kingsbury, his pastor, sent overseas because of some emergency. And it was when he was sending him overseas to escape police prosecution. And then Nate found out about a whole lot of other abuses and eventually got in contact with me through Grace. And also, Richard Duvall, the mission board, contacted me. Now they no longer support him, but they contacted me several months ago to say that there were additional allegations against Duvall in Bolivia, that he was teaching at a Bible Institute there, and some of the girls made allegations. And the admin, what he told me was that the admin didn't initially believe the girls or do anything about it. But as they tried to get help, they found the news articles about Duvall and realized he had previously offended. So they took those news articles and presented them to the Bible Institute, and so he was dismissed. But he's still working with youth, speaking at children's teen camps, coaching, as far as I know, still coaching high school girls and working with the deaf ministry and several other ministries. Periodically, I'll get updates from the group up at Kingsbury with additional allegations, but he's not in the U.S. and can't be prosecuted until he's in the U.S. Periodically, also, the police investigation is reactivated. When he's in the news again, I'll find out the case is open. But until he comes back to the U.S., as far as I know, he can't be prosecuted.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry for the further pain that comes with that, because I think justice is something that all survivors deserve. It will never completely heal the abuse that has happened, but I think that it is something that can be validating and healing. And to have an abuser that, because of a pastor sent him across seas to make sure he wouldn't be prosecuted. Like, it's so disgusting, all that stuff that happens in the IFB. And oh my gosh, yeah, I've talked to Nate. I need to have him. We've talked about him coming on the show. I think we'll record something probably next year. But something else I want to ask, just to make sure the listeners have the timeline right. Could you say the timeline of the things that happened? So with you growing up and seeing Bob Jones III come over and cover up abuse, what year was that?
That would have been, I believe it was 1980, but I can't
Around
be
that
100.
time. I
Yes,
got you.
somewhere around that time.
Around that time. And then the abuse that you experienced, when did that happen?
It was the very end of 1993.
Okay, got you. And then I just want to clarify, when did you tell Bob Jones? Was it that year or right after it happened? Did you tell them?
The teacher found out that day, and
Okay,
the notes that I have in December, so before the end of that month, Berg and Miller
okay.
both knew that
Hmm.
Berg had interviewed me and Miller had interviewed Richard Duvall. Richard confessed, but one of the things that he said in his confession was that he kept thinking of Dr. Bob saying that back of every tragedy in human character, there is a slow process of wicked thinking. He said he had apologized to me and wanted to know what else he could do to help me. And he was told that if he had asked forgiveness by the blood of Christ, he simply needed to pray for her. And pretty much that's the end of it. I think the hard part of that is that feeling that when people do really truly evil things, it's they're being taught that it's justified because they are evil. And so they're just acting out who they are. And it's really not that big of a deal. Say you're sorry, ask for forgiveness. It's covered, it's over. But the victim is the one then looked at as a terrible person because they're struggling with the trauma, and struggling with trauma is a sin. So then they're living in sin, but the perpetrator's perfectly fine.
Oh my gosh. And the sad thing is they don't acknowledge that. They don't acknowledge the trauma because, like you had said earlier, they don't have legitimate counseling at all. And it's just mind-boggling to me because there's such a big difference between being imperfect and purposely doing an abusive act.
One of the things you asked me when I talked to Berg during the Grace Report, one of the things he said to me was that I couldn't forgive Richard Duvall because he had never repented, which was kind of interesting to me that he made that statement saying that he never repented, but yet they brought him back to school, graduated him, gave him a missions degree, brought him back to campus to recruit further missionaries. And we're even bringing him back to the campus during the Grace investigation, still supporting him.
Oh
But
my,
yet he's saying he never repented.
yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I just, yeah, that system is horrible. Before the Grace Report happened, they'd already been talking to you. What year was that?
It would have been the year before. I think I did the police report in 2011. I'd have to look at that to be sure. But that was after I had talked to Boz, after
Hmm.
I was getting help from Julie Valentine Center and
Hmm.
understanding this is something I needed to report to the police.
And I'm curious too, like after being silenced and shamed in that system for so long, how did you get the resources or even the language to know what to do to get help from the police and from other people?
Some of it was there were two other victims that had already, one of the victims was kind of in connection with Bob Jones, and the other was somebody who was in the Grace Report. And both of them, Buzz helped me connect with them, and they had both already done police reports. And so they walked me through a lot of it. They gave me a lot of encouragement just about how difficult the process would be, but also how to navigate
Mm.
through it. Julie Valentine Center is absolutely incredible. They've poured years of support into helping me navigate it. The first time I went in there, I thought for sure when I told them anything, they would say, yes, it's your fault. I had no idea that they would not think that God did this to me. It's been a slow process. I feel like a lot of people learn a lot more quickly than I do, but it has been a very slow process. I'm still getting counseling now, and my therapist is fantastic. But yeah, it's been a slow journey.
But I'm so glad to hear that you're on that journey. And it's understandable that it's taken that time because you were gaslit and abused and manipulated in a system that did not want you to even get that help. That going outside of that system would be like losing your salvation. It would be
Right.
leading you down a dark path. That's just so much control. And it is so hard to get past that. So just give, I hope you've been able to give yourself that self compassion through the
This
process
the
of this.
spiritual part has definitely been the hardest thing to navigate. The fear that if I say anything, I'm sending people to hell. I don't believe any of that anymore, but that has taken a long time to relearn a concept of God that he's causing rape.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Yes. Oh my goodness. But was there anything else that you have wanted to share? I don't know if you wanted to share the letters at all,
The one to Dr. Stephen Jones,
if you're comfortable. And then, if you're comfortable, what was the date that you sent it to him?
February 6, 2012.
Okay.
And I mentioned that I was happy about their proposal to develop a committee to review Bob Jones's sexual abuse policy. And then I went into the details. I told him when I graduated, where I worked, the details. I named the offender, Richard Duvall, and listed that he was in the ministerial program. I explained that we were acquaintances, coworkers only, and did not know each other. But specifically, what happened that night, I mentioned the teacher who helped me and how she contacted Jim Berg at the time and reported it, that he called me in and how he responded to me. I talked about Tony Miller, the following year contacting me to tell me that Richard was returning to BJU. He asked me if I was planning to cause any trouble for Richard that would prevent him from completing his degree. I informed him that I was very fearful of Richard being in the area and told him that after he assaulted me, he had come to my house several evenings, leaving notes on my car and what was the content of the notes. I also told him that after the incident, Richard had tried to return to work with me again. And that's when he laughed and said that he was shocked that I would see him as a threat, as from his perspective, he couldn't conceive of why Richard would want anything to do with me after what had happened. The implication to me was that I was the one who caused Richard's trouble and he would want to avoid me so that I couldn't cause him more trouble. I asked Miller if he could assure me that Richard would be kept away from me. Mr. Miller said that he would be confined to the campus and there would be absolutely no way that he could have contact with me. But shortly after this conversation and Richard's return to campus, I was contacted by my employer notifying me that he was applying to work with me again. That was another piece of the story that, as that unraveled, the school was contacted again and informed that was happening. And he was told not to pursue employment there. I talked about how I learned that Richard is a missionary, that his qualification for becoming a missionary was the degree that BJU gave him, in spite of knowing that he's guilty of a criminal sexual assault. Shortly after he was expelled and came back, he was asked to pray before the chapel. Unless you've gone there, that's kind of doesn't mean a whole lot, but that's a very strong indication of approval. They were only the very special preacher boys, the best of the best. So that was a very strong statement that they support him. And so I talked through all of this, why he was allowed to return. I said, in your recent announcement initiating a committee to review your sexual abuse policy, you stated that you want to know of any improvements we can make in how we respond to and lovingly support individuals who experienced abuse, helping them deal with its lingering results. I explained how the response to me only added to my shame, that the school was not at all concerned that Richard could potentially do this to other students or to future victims, and they were not concerned for me. And then I talked about the various teachers that had varied beliefs about sexual abuse and gave them two specific situations. One was Chuck Phelps, and one was the pastor of the church that I went to, when he said that young children who are molested attract the offender because of their own impurity. And then another teacher that shared on a blog that in the past, a teenage rape victim, had she lived in Bible times, would have been stoned or forced to be a rapist, polygamous wife. And these were statements that I read. These were things that I read online, and said I had no agenda whatsoever to hurt the school in any way. I do not wish to hurt or humiliate anyone involved. My only desire is to do what I can to encourage these situations to be handled differently in the future. Then I went on and said that I now was aware of multiple people with sexual abuse experiences, and that every story shares the common thread that legal reports were at least to some degree discouraged, even when younger siblings were at home continuing to live in abusive situations. Some report that their pastors were notified. Said, when I hear that each of these people share their story, I hear the same thing each time. Each feels like no one was willing to help, and each felt further shamed by the counsel they received. BJU's response did not communicate that they cared or that God cared. Students returned home to abusive situations, and their siblings continued to endure abuse. Again, I don't understand. For one thing, all school personnel are considered mandated reporters when children are involved. But even if they weren't mandated by law, how can someone know that a child is being abused and do nothing? And so then after that, I asked them to hire Grace. And I said, I believe that BJU has the opportunity and potential to help change this. I was referencing to abuse situations being covered in churches all around the world. And if Bob Jones responds well to this, they can make a change. They can be a part of making a change. That obviously didn't happen.
And so what was Stephen's response to that letter, or did he respond?
He did not respond. I do know that it reached the Council of 5 people,
Okay.
and that there was an attorney there who mocked it and tried to say that I was not credible. The interesting thing was that attorney was the husband of somebody that had been my coworker, and that coworker is in my documents, having called Bob Jones to find out the details of the assault. And she was the one who came back to me when I was at work a year later and said, "Why in the world did no one report the rape?" And so I know for sure he knew that it was factual. But there was one other thing that happened when, after I reported to the police subpoenaed the records at Bob Jones. And Marshall Franklin called me and told me about it and said that God had provided them with an out for that to protect the school, that their attorney told them that they were legally permitted to destroy any records that they didn't want to be a part of the school's permanent file before they responded to the subpoena. And so I asked him, do you understand that that's protecting a rapist who is very likely or very possibly offending against others? His response was kind of a shocked, no, this is God providing protection to the school. This is God's provision to protect the school. Again, it was always about protecting the school, not about protecting potential victims from a perpetrator. So they did destroy the records. They told me they destroyed the records. They kept only what they wanted to be a part of this permanent file that the police could see. Still later, the police told me that Tony Miller wouldn't talk to them. And I asked Marshall Franklin about that. And he said, again, that was God's provision to protect the school, that he supported the faculty not getting involved in the investigation, as that would be protective towards the school.
My goodness. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I think that it's important for people to know, because there's still people who say, "Oh, the school doesn't care about protecting its reputation," blah blah blah, which is absolute bullcrap. A lot of the people very indoctrinated into that system don't see that. Sadly, they do not see that. But yeah, is there anything else that you guys wanted to share?
I think that's everything.
Oh my God. And I know with your story with Berg, he ended up giving you these different tapes. I'm not sure if you're comfortable talking about that.
Yes, left his office. I felt hopeless. I mean, honestly, I was suicidal, mostly because I felt like I would never be able to please God. So this was going to be my life. I was fearful of going to hell the way they described hell, but I was also fearful of heaven because God was there and I feared him. Oh, I really feared him. But Berg gave me 4 cassette tapes that had the recordings of what he said would be follow-up counseling for me. And they would be basically answer any questions that I had about what had happened. The first one was the one I feel like that was the one that was the most significant and the only one that I've been able to listen to since then. I have not gone back and listened to the others, but in it, he's talking to, as far as I can tell, he's at the Wilds and he's talking to high schoolers from Bob Jones that had gone there as for a retreat. And he's telling them that the only answer to any life problems they have is learning more about God. That he mentioned specifically that he has kids daily coming to his office who are the victims of sexual abuse and other types of abuse in their homes, and that the only provision that God gives to them to respond to that is for them to learn about God, learn more of his characteristics, that these things are happening so that they will learn more about him, learn about his character, and the only hope that they have, pretty much to end it, is to learn about God, find out what it is that God is trying to teach them. He mocks counseling. He tells them that they aren't to tell other people about or complain about what's happening to them, that this is just between them and God. So it's more confirmation of everything he said to me, only he was talking to minors. These were kids. that were being instructed essentially to submit to abuse and not ask for help, not go to counseling.
Oh my goodness. And I don't know what you're comfortable sharing about the other tapes. I know you said it's been a long time since you've listened to those.
The others, I think they're more of the same. They're three sermons from Berg. All three were presented to high schoolers at the Wilds, Bob Jones high schoolers. I believe it was a senior retreat. And then the fourth one was by Dr. Bob Jr. And I've passed on the tapes, but I have not listened to the last ones. I just, after the first one, listening to it again, I couldn't listen to them again.
Yeah. And how did the messages of these tapes, how do they impact you when you listen to them after counseling with Berg?
It was horrifying. I think it was painful for me because it reminded me of the things that he said to me. But I think realizing that he's talking to high schoolers, that even the academy students are being told these same messages. That if one of the statements that he said is, if you're having these problems, it's because you're immature. So basically, these kids, if they're in a home situation or in a situation where they're being sexually abused or they're being physically abused or emotionally abused, it's because of their immaturity. It's because of their lack of being able to follow God perfectly. I teach middle schoolers. I look at them, when I'm teaching them, they're kids. And to think that kids are being taught these messages it makes me sick. And the school insists that all of Berg's teaching were biblical and that these are still the things that they teach. And so it's sickening to me to realize that even today in 2024, these are still the messages that students are being given. And I don't know how that's possible. That's what propels me to speak, not what happened years ago. It's the idea that this is the counsel that people are being given.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for speaking up because it does make a difference. Because what that environment does is like there's so much shame. Shame is a powerful tool of control, and shame is a tool that is used to silence people because shame causes people to blame themselves. And because that shame, Brene Brown, she talks about how shame thrives in secrecy, silence, and judgment. And I'm trying to remember, she had an antidote to shame, but I know it was like empathy and being heard, basically, something like that. And that environment just instills so much shame across the board.
Just that you can't speak. If you speak, then what I was told was that if I spoke about this, people would end up going to hell because if I spoke, then anybody who I speak to is perhaps not going to trust God and not going to follow God. So I would be the one condemning them to hell for speaking. And that's a terrifying thing to feel like if you ever leak out what has happened to you, you're responsible then for the eternal destruction of another person.
Oh my God. That is such a horrible burden to put on anyone. And then so much more worse, I feel like, to put on a victim of sexual abuse. And what I've definitely been learning as I've been talking with different survivors, and even as I've done the first podcast, abusive relationships, high control groups or cults, coercive control is like the core of this. And really, when you came forward, I just see all kinds of elements of coercive control, like even with the notes at night, then also you being silenced and saying that you're going to hurt all these people, you're going to hurt this man's reputation, just all these things to control you and control the situation and not care about you at all. And just one of the things that's so frustrating to me with people who are like, Bob Jones can change, Bob Jones can change, and blah, blah, blah. Authoritarian, narcissistic, like high control institutions aren't going to change because they don't really care about their followers. They care about what their followers will do for them, but they don't really care. They're very disposable. And I just wish people would understand that. But something else I want to mention which I don't know if you're comfortable mentioning it or not, and I can cut it out, but I know Berg did reach out to you asking back for these tapes. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. I talked with him either just before the Grace investigation or during the Grace investigation when I went to the school to get my records because I had done a police report and I was trying to get the records from him. And he asked if I still had the tapes and asked to get them back. He was very, very concerned about getting the tapes back. At the time, I didn't realize that I still had them. So, I mean, I thought they were long gone, and I told him I didn't know where they were. And it was very clear that he wanted the cassettes back. I didn't know. I guess I thought that all of those teachings were well known. I'm not sure if I know that the school said that they went back and checked all of his teachings and verified that all of his teachings are biblical and that they stand behind them. I don't know if these are in lots of sermons, hundreds of sermons, or if these are ones that weren't destroyed. I really don't know what to think, but just that I know he wanted them back.
Okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that because thankfully you shared the audio versions or the digital files of the tapes with me, and that is something I will be releasing because I'm trying to remember in the Grace report, didn't they ask him about these materials that he gave survivors? I'm trying to remember.
I'm not sure. I know
Okay,
in their response, they said that they reviewed all of his materials and that
okay.
they were all biblically sound, but I'm not sure. I don't remember.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I'm not sure either. But yeah, I'm definitely going to I'll release those for people to hear. And it seems like he was scared of being out. That's what I get from that. He is scared that those tapes, someone else might get a hold, they might become public. So of course I'm going to make them
Right.
public. Let's do it. Let's make it public
Yeah,
for
that's the
people to hear.
feeling I got. I think also the fact that in them he specifically states that kids came to him
Uh,
daily with reports of abuse and that this was the advice that he gave them. It's pretty condemning when they say that they didn't do anything illegal. And he's talking to kids, he's talking to minors in these cassettes, and he's specifically stating, this is what happened. This is what has been happening. Kids come to me daily with these reports, and this is my advice to them.
well, I thank you for sending the tapes to me and trusting me with it and allowing me to release that because I think it is important for people to hear the horrible things and advice that he gave and hear the harm that it has caused. 'Cause I think people don't want to know the extent of the harm. There are people who definitely don't want it to see the light of day at all.
I agree.
And one of the reasons I enjoy making this podcast is there's always been like a lot of these Bob Jones people speaking for survivors or shaming them. But now survivors are coming forward and they can tell their own stories and people can listen for themselves. They can't control the narrative anymore. They
Right.
can't do that. And so that's one of the reasons I enjoy making it. It's like a nice like FU to Bob Jones. Like you don't get to control the narrative anymore. Survivors get to tell their own stories and it's just the power that can come from that.
I feel like they had the opportunity after the Grace report to make things right, and they've had 10 years. And a lot of people have been silent for those years, hoping and wishing for change, and that's not going to happen.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I think you're right about that. And they act like they have, but I don't think they have. And I remember watching an interview of Bob Jones III and his response to the Grace report, and he acted like it wasn't a big deal. Oh, it was just this amount of people. And but all of us know that the Grace report is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
There's so many more people that did
I
not come forward or
I
could not.
personally know of several people who some were minors and it happened in the academy, and many others who never, they either didn't know about that the Grace report was happening, so they didn't participate, or they were too fearful, or they were in had little kids and just really struggled with being able to navigate that and didn't participate in the report, but were also victims.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And so when did they reach out to you about the Grace report?
So I actually talked with Grace prior to them being hired by Bob Jones. I talked with Boz and told him my concerns, told him some of what I was seeing online from other survivors. Before that time, I thought I was the only one. And so it didn't occur to me to do anything. Once I realized there were a lot of others, I talked with him and he told me a little bit about their services and how they had done other investigations. In February of 2012, after Stephen Jones, he got put together that 5-person panel. I wrote him a 3-page letter detailing out exactly what had happened to me, the interview with Berg, the interview with Miller, all that I had found out about my perpetrator now being a missionary, and that Bob Jones was supporting him, bringing him back to the campus to recruit other missionaries. By then, I had already seen different statements by some of their faculty members. One of them said that, told a teenage rape victim that had she lived in Bible times, she would have been stoned, and seemed to approve of that. So I put all of that in the letter and asked for them to hire Grace. They didn't hire Grace because of my letter. There were a lot of people petitioning and there were a lot of people doing a variety of things. But by the time they did hire Grace, it was something that I wanted to happen. I was very nervous and very scared about being a part of it, but I also felt hopeful that it meant something good would come from all of our experiences. So when they invited us to participate, I was thankful, but I kind of had already seen it coming.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I can imagine maybe there were mixed feelings that came with that because this institution that had just beyond betrayed you and subjected you to so much further harm. How did you feel going back thinking, okay, well, maybe they're trying to do the right thing? What, were you distrustful? Were you kind of hesitant? Or were you like, I need to do this for other survivors?
I was pretty naive. Like, I really did believe that if they fully knew all that had happened, I thought that they would respond rightly. It's not that I fully trusted that, but I hoped that in a very naive way. There were a lot of others who would say, don't trust this. But during the investigation, like I talked directly to Marshall Franklin, who was one of the vice presidents, talked openly with him, told him about my experiences, pleaded with him to do the right thing. He assured me throughout that I would find out as soon as they released the response, that I would find out how genuinely repentant they really were. And I did believe that to a degree. So I was pretty shocked by the response when it did come out.
And so, in that process, when you were being interviewed, how did you feel like their response was to you?
Bob Jones's response or Grace's response?
I guess both response, if you're
Um,
comfortable sharing.
Grace was fantastic. I was so filled with shame, and so I still hadn't processed really anything. I still didn't understand that this was not something God had done to me. I was still figuring some of that out. Some of the things they said in the interview were from the Bible and really shocked me that perhaps God really did care about me, that He didn't do this to me. Jones, I heard Dr. Bob's comments. I don't remember the exact phrase, but talking about those who were talking about abuse were tools of Satan or tools of the devil. So that was very confusing and very painful. I wasn't one who was public about what had happened to me. I was very, very private about it, partly because of my own struggles and partly because I felt like if I adjusted just with Bob Jones, they really were going to do the right thing. And that was not going to happen. That was my naivety. But I did believe that.
Mm.
And
Yeah. And so, what was, because I know the report or the investigation was halted. And like when that happened, what were your thoughts and feelings
I
around that?
was devastated. I was struggling so much from going back and revisiting what had happened. I had PTSD. I was getting counseling. I was really, really struggling. I had small children, and I felt like my life had been ripped apart trying to process through all that happened. And then when they stopped, that was agonizing. Partly, I live in this community, so I heard the people in the community accusing the victims of trying to destroy Bob Jones, trying to harm Bob Jones, and they didn't know that I was part of that. These are people that I knew, often people I called friends, and people at the church I attended at the time, and they were accusing all these bitter graduates of trying to destroy the school. And in my heart, I kept thinking, no, we're trying to help. We're trying to help victims. We're trying to help current and future victims, but we're also trying to help the school do the right thing. And so it was because by then I knew they knew the truth. They did know. And so they just shut it down. I felt a burden of what happens to current victims, what happens to future victims. Are they, is this just supposed to keep going on for decades and won't end? And what can I do?
Yeah, I know. And they did, because of pressure, they did, start the investigation again. And then, of course, I think the investigation, it took 2 years total.
Yeah.
And when the Grace report was finally released, how did you feel about, like, what were the feelings around that and the thoughts?
My initial feeling was just relief that it was over, relief that something good was going to come out of it. I really did believe the school would respond well. And I believed if they didn't initially, then the churches in the community would encourage them to respond better. I also believed that the legal system would encourage them to respond better. So a lot of relief initially until Bob Jones responded.
And yeah, and whatever you're comfortable sharing with, how did they respond to that?
From my perspective, they responded very poorly. They apologized if victims didn't feel well served. They didn't really acknowledge any of their own wrongdoing. They implied that the abuses that happened were all things that happened in the students' home communities, that they really had no connection to Bob Jones. I knew that wasn't the case for my own story, but I also knew that there were other assaults on campus. These were now my friends, people I knew and had gotten to know well during the investigation. And so it was shocking. The day that their response came out, the vice president, Marshall Franklin, called me just very shortly before it came out and said that I would be disappointed by the response, that the response, they were going to initially admit fault and take responsibility for the things that happened, but they decided instead to err on the side of their constituency, and they were not going to be taking responsibility for it. And so my response to him quickly before I thought through it was, why are you still working there? Like, I don't understand. How can you say that you're following God and be okay with this when you know that this is destroying a lot of people? This has destroyed a lot of people's faith. It's destroyed people mentally and emotionally, and you're still there. Like, I don't understand. He's just, I think he said it's complicated, or I don't know, but it was devastating. I think the hardest part was hearing the church's reactions in the community and people's reactions in the community. They didn't want to read the report. They said that they had been told that it was all lies and that the survivors were just trying to destroy Christianity. It was really hard.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. So sorry. It's just for survivors, a big part of the healing process is to feel seen, heard, and understood. And Bob Jones did not do that. And it is sadly another example of them trying to control the narrative, putting the institution above helping the members, about helping the victims. And I feel like that kind of leads into the next thing. Did they follow any other recommendations from the Grace Report?
From their perspective, they'll give a narration that shows that they did follow the guidelines. But both what I read and also calling them and talking to them and asking questions, the one big thing that they did is they agreed that now, if they get reports of abuse and it involves minors, they'll report it to the police. And they have separated the counseling office from the disciplinary office. And that's about it. Oh, they also do training once a year so that teachers and staff can be aware of what abuse is and just the fact that they're mandatory reporters. But their counseling is still the exact same system of counseling, the same harm that was caused to me and countless others. That's still their counsel. That's still their belief system. They still shame the victims. They still tell them that this is happening because God is trying to teach you something about himself. And so the destruction is still happening. They don't recommend any counseling other than what their counseling is, and it's just nouthetic counseling. They have no licensed counselors. They believe all licensed counseling is sinful. You can get help for cancer, for heart disease, for cavities, all kinds of other things. But if you've been through trauma, you don't have the right to seek professional help.
And I think part of that is still it's that cult control. It's they
Right,
don't want anyone influencing your mind other than them having
right,
any other impact. And that's what I've taken away as they've still clung to that model. I'm like, it's all about indoctrination and
right.
control at the cost of the lives of victims and their own well-being. Oh my gosh. And I have Mazak's, I think it's his biblical, one of his biblical counseling notebooks from one of his classes, and it's horrible. Yeah, I'm gonna cover it sometime on the show, but it's a lot. Oh my gosh.
I encountered Mazak too.
Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, his teaching is very, very flawed and very, very limiting and blame filled towards victims and
Yeah.
towards anyone who struggles, whether they struggle from a mental health disorder or from the effects of trauma or illnesses. He's just not tolerant.
Mm, yeah.
It's somehow always categorized as a sin of the person who's suffering.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And so with all this trauma and harm and abuse that you've experienced from Bob Jones University, do you feel like it's worth it if they did change? Is it worth it for them to change, or do you feel like the place should just shut down?
That's a really hard question. I have friends who teach there. I have friends who still know people who go there as students. I I know some of the teachers who I think are really fantastic teachers. At the same time, the harm that they cause, specifically in the area of counseling, the seminary, the teaching that they're preparing seminary students to go out, and my offender was a seminary student, and they're okay with sexual offenders graduating from the school. Their response is just, it's a sin. If you confess it, then the blood of Jesus, I have this in writing, what they wrote to my offender. They said, the blood of Jesus has completely covered your offense, and you just need to pray for the victim, and you need to go on and continue studying and follow Jesus, be a missionary, etc. And so that, in that sense, I say no, absolutely not. The beliefs that they still hold are destroying the name of Jesus. They're destroying victims. They're perpetuating the cycle of abuse. They're empowering offenders. I don't know if their abuse is worse towards their victims or towards their offenders, because the offenders have been taught you're evil and wicked. So if you commit a sexual offense, you're simply carrying out what you are. So they're told that that's what their identity is. So then when they go and do these things, it's kind of excused as well, this is who you are. Just say you're sorry, admit to God, yes, you're a sinner, and this is your identity, and then go on. And so that cycle of abuse for the offenders and for the victims is not going to halt while they hold the views that they have. So it's not a really clear answer. I
It's all good.
don't
No.
think that their counseling in seminary should continue at all, or that they should have access to counsel anyone or
Yeah.
to train. The student said
Yeah. Yeah.
they're
Thank you.
cultivating a society where offending is a normal thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you for sharing that because definitely people might answer differently to each person I would ask, but I think it's an honest answer, and I appreciate that because I know there are good faculty there at Bob Jones, and it's just complicated because I know on the first podcast talking about complicity in that system also, so it is a complicated
Mm-hmm.
thing. But the last question, I think is going to be a really powerful one because when this is coming out, it will mark the 10th anniversary of the Grace Report being released. And on the anniversary, I'm curious what message or words would you like to say to Bob Jones University?
I have thought about that, and I don't know that I have a message for the Bob Jones admin. I feel like I would like to appeal to their faculty who are not aware of these things. Please read the Grace Report. Don't believe what they've said. Read it for yourself. I talked to one faculty member who, when she found out I had been a victim, she specifically said, "Don't tell me anything. I don't want to know anything because then if I know, then I'm accountable before God." And so I wanted to tell her, no, you need to know because you work there. You're pouring your heart and your life into this institution. You need to know what it is that you're pouring your heart in and your work into because you can do better than this. But what I would like to speak to more is those who are been victimized. You're not without hope. The things that you were taught there, that is not your actual identity. That's not who you are. There's so much hope if you pursue actual licensed counseling that can help. Trauma can be, you can get, there's hope. There's so much hope and there's so much help out there, but it's not going to come from the counseling that Bob Jones provides. That's going to lock you in and chain you in and suffocate you till you have nothing left. To the admin, I don't know that I have any words. I feel like they've made their choices knowingly, and I don't know that any appeal is going to change their direction. I'm sad because I think they're accountable for that, and that's a really heavy, but it's their choice.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I feel like that was an answer that was true to you. And I'm glad you're being true to you and being honest. And it is a sad thing when there are people that could make change, could make things better, but you know they won't. But I want to thank you so much for your strength, your courage, your bravery, for coming forward and just sharing just these just horrific things that you've gone through that you should have never gone through and how they treated you in a time when you needed so much love and compassion. And I'm just so grateful that you're being a voice for other survivors and making people aware of how Bob Jones University treats survivors of abuse.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It is such a difficult thing to revisit a lot of these things. And I know, and I'm sure it's been difficult preparing for the interview. And especially as like this week, lecture week, so many things have been, it's tough. It's a tough week that we're recording this, but you're making a difference by sharing this. It is going to be impactful. There are people that are going to hear this that they'll be encouraged to speak up. And I'm so sorry for all the control and the manipulation and the abuse that you were subjected to all across the board.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
really do appreciate it. And I do hope that more survivors find their way out.
Yeah, me too. Me too. But yes,
It's nice on the other side.
it definitely is. It is. The healing journey is hard, but it's worth it. It is so worth it. And to connect and be with people where you can be yourself. You don't have to worry. You don't have to be this perfect person all the time.
I
Of
really do
course.
appreciate what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm honored to be able to do this work and make people aware. But thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you.